Okay, so this will be the video lecture for plant centers of origin. If you are struggling with the internet, there is an annotated version of this as a PDF on Carmen. Okay, so it's important to understand what we mean when we say center of origin. This is the geographical location where the species originally started. You'll have your original species there. You might have some related genera there. You might have some wild ancestors that are still there. The diseases and insects and predators and things that these plants evolved with all are in that area. And when we take those crops out of those areas, then they have to adapt to all new diseases, insects, predators, ways of growing, etc., etc. So if we know where a crop came from, that can allow us to go back to that area for new genetics or different genetics if we need to. Now, I'm not asking you to memorize all of these things, and it should be on the handout. You should have all of this listed already on your handout, so you don't have to worry about that. But take a look at the types of crops and all of the major crops that we have. So corn is obviously a major crop, tomatoes are a major crop, cotton is a major crop. So for us, a lot of our current common crops already come from this country or areas that are nearby, which means they're adapted to our locations. So think about why knowing where that is from could be helpful to growers, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but in the future that could be helpful. So if we look at crops from South America, you'll see that we have lowland crops, meaning crops that are from low-lying areas, or highland crops, meaning crops that are from mountains. And again, take a look at some of these very large areas. Cotton, in other words, has a wide growing range, everywhere from North America all the way down through South America, which means if something goes wrong with cotton, we can look to a wide range of areas where it's native to find ways to get around that and genetics that might be helpful. Not as many things from Australia and the South Pacific, which makes sense, but look at sugarcane. We are now one of the largest producers of sugarcane. What if something came along and wiped out our sugarcane? So we might be able to go back to scientists and growers in Australia and say, let me see if we can breed our sugarcane to your sugarcane. Let me get some flowers. Let me get a couple of plants and see if we can make a difference. Asia is the same thing. But think about, why do we have lots of crops that are from some areas and not really from many from other areas? We didn't get a whole lot of things from Australia and the Pacific, but we get lots of things from Asia. This actually works out in our ornamental crops as well. We have lots of Japanese and Chinese ornamental plants in this country. Why? Because the climates are very similar. The climate is not very similar in Australia, but it is very similar to large swaths of Asia. Lots and lots of crops come from Africa. Now look what we see here again. Notice all the different types of cotton there would be. So if something happened to cotton, we could easily go back and look at genetics from lots of different countries. This is one here we want to keep an eye on right here, coffee, because coffee is originally from Africa. Rice is originally from Africa. And yet many Asian countries and the United States and now South America grow both coffee and cotton. Why might that be? Some of it has to do with soil, some of it has to do with production systems, but if something goes wrong, then we hopefully can go back to some of the original countries and fix that. Again, some of the things. Notice that some plants, we've talked about cotton a little bit. Here's another one, grapes. Grapes have a very wide area where they're native to, which means they have a very wide area that they're adapted to. If you remember when we were talking about land races and ecotypes, if you can grow grapes perhaps here in Spain, those grapes are going to be different from the ones that are grown here. They're going to be different from the ones that are grown here, meaning we have all of this different genetics within grapes to adapt to a wide variety of conditions. We've talked a little bit about domestication syndrome, but plants can also lose other things, some of which we want. We don't want wheat, for example, to use its natural seed distribution system of seed shattering and falling to the ground, because we want that seed on the plant. It makes it a lot easier to harvest than going around and picking them up off the ground. But we also don't want the plants to have toxic or bitter properties. But those plants developed those things so that herbivores didn't like them. So when we take that stuff away, then sometimes that's better tasting to insect or animals. And so we have more problems with those. So we know there are some challenges of domestication. This is a science. I'm not saying for you guys to memorize this stuff or for you to be an expert in this stuff. How does this help you necessarily in any individual growing season? It probably doesn't. But if we have a massive wipeout of a crop, maybe knowing where that crop is coming from allows scientists to go back to that area, look at the way those plants are grown, look at the genetics of those plants, and use that to help future crops for us. But the reality is, it's part of our history. It's part of human culture. Crop production is part of our culture. So understanding that culture can be very, very helpful. And if nothing else, it's part of our history, and knowing our history is a good thing. We want to know the pests and the weeds from an area. Because if we know that, for example, emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer, we seem to have many, many plants here in this country that have a problem with emerald ash borer. But in Asia, where that insect is from, they don't have any problems. So what's different? What are the predators of emerald ash borer where it's from? This can cause problems with our crop plants. Late blight of potato caused the famine in Ireland. Lack of crop diversity and resistance made that even worse. So you can go back to the original genetics from South America, and you can start breeding resistance back into the good crop plants that we want. We think of coffee as a South American plant. It's not originally. It's originally, as you saw, from Africa. But we don't grow it there anymore because the coffee plants that we like got a rust disease, and so now we grow coffee in South America. The challenge we're having, of course, is this rust is now being found in our South American coffees as well. The same thing with tomato verticillium. There are types of tomatoes that are resistant to verticillium, and there are types of tomatoes that are not resistant to verticillium, and you want to make sure you're growing the proper tomatoes in the area of the country that you are in. So if we have some basic understanding of this, scientists can go back and look for new genes. We can preserve the diversity of genes in case there's an issue. So if I go to this article, which I don't expect you to read, the article itself is fairly old, so I don't necessarily expect you to read the entire article, but what I want you to look at is kind of the abstract. With the increasing use of biotechnology in crop improvement, the value of germplasm already collected and conserved will substantially increase as researchers seek out new sources of useful genes in the future. That's the last sentence of that paragraph there, and you can see that this is something that we have been doing for a while because we know at some point crops are going to have problems. So we've talked a little bit about the seed banks, and we know that there are procedures for harvesting genetics. And so you can see here, we acquire the different genetics. You have to document what they are doing, what they are, what the plant looks like. We have to find some way to preserve the seeds or the DNA somehow. We have to make sure that we can regenerate that. We can distribute it to different breeders and growers. Everything has to be documented and characterized, whether that's through genetic analysis or written analysis. We have to evaluate these things in the field, and it's not just us. It's not just us evaluating them here in Ohio, but we have to evaluate this in various parts of the country because what might be good here in Ohio is not necessarily good in Iowa or Kansas or California. And this is done all over the country. Again, I've kind of showed these things. So this is showing the country's different seed banks. And if you click on these, you can navigate to the various areas that are what they're collecting in there. So in Columbus, for example, we have the ornamental seed bank. If you click on any of these other ones, you can see what the different plants that they are collecting in the various areas. Because it's important that we have both our major crops and our minor crops saved as much as we possibly can. And the reason we do this is we don't like to eat the wild stuff. If you look at these tomatoes and tomatillos, the little tiny ones are the wild ones. And those aren't really good for eating. But we've bred them into the ones on the left-hand side. The same thing with the potatoes. Right? The little tiny ones are the wild potatoes, and the ones on the left are the modern potatoes. But maybe those wild potatoes are resistant to some disease that domesticating our potatoes is causing problems with. Same thing happens in fruits. So if we look at these tiny little blueberries and those tiny little strawberries, those are the wild ones, and we don't like to eat those. We like the bigger ones. Wild blueberries don't really taste all that great. Wild strawberries don't really taste all that great. So we've bred them to be larger, more flavorful, more colorful. We've also bred them to be white. In this case, that's also the result of breeding. So that is not a wild strawberry. That is the result of breeding, and we're now breeding those to be bigger and fleshier as well. This happens with every single fruit. If you do a Google search for any type of wild fruit, wild eggplants, wild watermelons, you will find that the original versions of these plants look nothing like our domestic versions. But those original versions may house genetics that we can continue to use in our modern versions. And that's the important part to take away from this. Not memorizing what plant came from where, but understanding that utilizing the genetics of those wild types and saving those genetics just in case is really, really important. Okay, as always, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to get in touch.